portion. It was an interesting portion. I joked with David because last week he had the one that went through all different laws, one after another, and I said, I had the short one. This one is only a chapter, so I got the easy one this week. But I found that as you begin to go and you begin to look at this, Yahweh's word is amazing because he will always reveal something new that you have not seen before. And as I began to study this, I thought, oh my goodness, the direction he began to take it, I was wondering, and I'd ask, well, what does this have to do with the Shemitah year? What does this have to do with what this Torah portion is about? Because it seemed to be going a distinct direction. And I have to say, I'm thankful for the praise and worship because I know we didn't collaborate, but every single song deals specifically with what I feel like the Father's saying in this week's Torah portion. And so for the rest of you, you may enjoy it, and it's lovely to be able to worship, but when you're one that has to get up and teach and you have a confirmation with that, that's exciting. Because then you know for a fact, Yahweh's trying to teach his people something. Amen? Amen. So without further ado, we're going to look at this week's Torah portion. It is titled Behar, on the mountain. And as we said, it's a short portion. It's Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1 through chapter 26, verse 2. And if you've read it, then you know it deals specifically with two topics. It deals with the laws concerning the Shemitah year, or the 7th sabbatical year, and then it goes into the laws of the Jubilee, or the 50th year. And when I saw that, oh my goodness, we've taught a lot about the Jubilee, lately especially. The Sukkot theme, Jubilee Sukkot. And I thought, well, what in the world am I going to pull out now? We spent a lot of time talking about this. And yet I found that it went a completely different direction than what you've seen before. And as I began to look at this, I believe that Yahweh's bringing this back to your attention. Everywhere you go, you're hearing about this, aren't you? You're hearing about the Shemitah years. You're hearing about a Jubilee, how this is on the horizon. And it seems as if he's beginning to stir his people up. And he's beginning to restore some things concerning this that we've lost. And as we begin to look at this, then we have to ask ourselves the question, because this is part of his calendar. It's just as important as the weekly Shabbat, as the feasts and festivals. We find that another part of his calendar is this yearly 7th year Shemitah year and the Jubilee. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is so important about this specific time frame, the 7th year, the Shemitah year, the Jubilee years? Was it just an agricultural law? Because we find that we're not in the land, and so a lot of people were arguing we're not in the land, so there's no need to keep the Shemitah or to worry about it. So really, what's the point? It's almost something that we put on a shelf. But when we get back to Israel, and we're all farmers, and we're all working until the land, then this is going to be important. Then we'll pay attention to these laws. And yet I found that when we begin to look at this, there's a lot more to what Yahweh's trying to teach us than just allowing the land itself to rest. Amen. There's some spiritual principles that he wants to teach you now. In fact, we rehearse it every Shabbat. It's a rehearsal of every 7th Shemitah year. And you're going to see that as we go and we begin to look at this. In fact, one thing that was interesting to me was that in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 21, the Shemitah year is connected for why Judah's kicked out of the land. We find that they're told to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And when I saw that, I thought, Yahweh doesn't do anything by accident. He doesn't make statements like this if it's not significant. And so when we're told specifically, and it's recorded for you and I to understand, that one of the reasons we get kicked out, one of the reasons the land will spew us out is when we don't keep the Shemitahs, when we don't understand this cyclical nature of his calendar, then obviously it's got to be important, doesn't it? And so we have to ask the question, then, could it be that if this is part of the reason that we're kicked out of the land, if this is part of the reason that we're dispersed among the nations, then maybe, with our lightning quick minds, that we can put 2 and 2 together, that maybe, just maybe, in order for us to return and get back, it's going to be because we now understand the lessons of the Shemitah. Yes. That maybe we missed some things that we thought it was just physical, but maybe he's trying to teach us the spiritual aspects of this. And when we finally learn the lessons, you're going to begin to see the breakthroughs in the return. Now, as I began to look at this, I decided, well, let's look at where it falls in the placement in these Torah portions because it's an interesting place that you find it. In fact, most scholars agree that where this portion is in the chronological order, that it's out of place. That this is actually from a previous encounter, a previous discussion that took place, and yet we find that it's placed specifically right here in this order of the book of Leviticus. So even though chronologically it's not really making sense because he goes from dealing with the priests specifically to now all of a sudden it's as if there's a parenthetical statement that takes place. And it's like, oh yes, the Shemitah years. And so we find that in the order of the Torah portions, this is the 9th portion of the book of Leviticus, and it's the 32nd of the Torah as a whole. Now, a lot of people will say, well, numbers, those aren't important. There's no reason, but yet we find everything that Yahweh does, he's specific about. He's very strategic, isn't he? Yeah. And so there's a reason he chose to place this right here. And we find that these numbers, the very placement of this discussion about the Shemitah and the Jubilee years, it's as if it's giving you some clues. Because it's not in its normal order, but specifically I'm putting it right here. It's the 9th one, it's the 32nd of the whole year. And so it's almost as if maybe there's something about these numbers that are going to help us understand what does it mean to keep the Shemitah? What is the sabbatical years about? And I found that when you begin to read this, if you don't understand the Shemitah, guess what? You'll never get to the Jubilee. You got to go through 7 Shemitahs before you can get to the Jubilee. So it seems that, now remember, Yahweh doesn't do anything by accident. It seems that there's a repetition, there's a rehearsal. 7 times you're being given an opportunity to get this right. And then finally, when we finally learn these lessons, then the Jubilee. Now let's look at these numbers. It's the 9th portion of the book of Leviticus. The number 9 in Hebrew is associated in the value of the Hebrew letter tet. Now this letter is an interesting letter of the Hebrew alphabet because of all the letters, it seems to be the one that most sums up the whole concept that we find throughout the scriptures, a blessing and a curse. Every single Hebrew word, depending on where you stand in covenant with Yahweh, will always have either a blessing or a curse that's associated with it, twofold. And when we see this letter tet, that's what it represents. It represents the 2 possibilities, the 2 potentials of man. Either for good or for evil. Either to be a blessing or to be a curse. Did you know you had a choice on whether you could be a blessing to those around you, a blessing to where he's placed you, or you can be a curse? Right. Isn't that interesting? Now, as we continue to look at the way this letter tet is written, the sages teach that it's inverted and it almost looks like a woman that's pregnant. And it seems to suggest that it's hidden. The seed that's been planted inside of her is hidden. And there's this promise of potential, this promise that there's going to be a birthing, but yet until the birth takes place, until the fruit is made evident, you don't know whether it's going to be the curse or the blessing. Because who knows what seed was planted and what's about to reproduce and come forth. As you look at this tet a little further, it was interesting to me because it's associated and it looks like almost the upside down image of the mem. The mem also represents a womb. And we understand that Hebrew language is a very pictographic language. He doesn't do this by accident. So we have 2 letters. We have the mem, which represents the womb, where the seed's going to be planted, where something's going to be birthed. And then we have the tet, but it's upside down, also representing a womb. And as I began to look at, well, what's the difference between these 2 letters? Because the Shemitah is being associated with the tet, this 9th letter, this womb, this seed that's been hidden, and we're waiting on this to be birthed. When you look at the tet, it's interesting because with it being upside down, the entrance for the seed, the opening is at the top, where the mem is at the bottom, looking more like the normal diagram, the normal picture. And so I thought, oh my goodness, if the opening's at the top for the seed to be inserted into this womb, do you think that maybe what Yahweh's drawing your attention to is the seed that's entering up here? That the Shemitah is dealing with the seed, the word that's going to enter in through these gateways into this womb. That what words you hear, there's going to be seed that's planted, and it's hidden for a season, but if you allow it to grow, there's going to be a harvest that's produced. And depending on what you've been listening to, depending on what you've been allowing access to this womb, is going to determine whether you're going to begin to enjoy the blessings or the curses. Now, as we look a little further, we find that this number 9, it's the 9th portion of Leviticus, it's also the number of the fruit of the Spirit. We're told in Galatians 5:22 through 23 that this is the fruit of the Spirit. Now, do you realize that you can't have the fruit of the Spirit if you're not walking out a consistent, intimate relationship with the King?
That's right.
There's no way that you're going to display these characteristics if you only see him once in a blue moon. There's no way you're going to display these characteristics if he's the last thing on your mind. The fruit of the Spirit will only be birthed through an intimate, consistent, walking this out, day by day relationship. And we're told that the fruit of this, the evidence of this relationship, would be faithfulness, gentleness, goodness, joy, kindness, long-suffering, love, peace, and self-control. And so you can actually take this and you can begin to look, well, what are these aspects? Am I displaying these in my own life? When we're going through things, are these the fruit that we find being birthed? Is this what's made evident? Or is it something else? Do you think that maybe the Shemitah has something to do with revealing a birthing process of what's been planted inside of you? And that maybe what he's trying to teach us is that whatever you birth, whatever's been planted in you is then going to result, and you're either going to have a blessing or a curse. And we find that during the Shemitah, remember, you're told you're not to plant. You're going to eat whatever's been planted prior to this, whatever's been growing and cultivated prior to this 7th year. And so we find when we begin to look at the Shemitah, the lesson that we begin to see is that for this time frame, you've been planting diligently, whether it be good or bad. And when the Shemitah gets here, whatever you decided and chose to allow to be planted, that's what you're going to eat.
Right.
And so now you can understand why the Shemitah can be a blessing or a curse. It has to do with what you've been planting. What have you been listening to? What words have been planted inside this womb right here? And we find that during the Shemitah, you're not going to plant anymore, but now you're going to reap that harvest. You're going to eat. You're going to live off of whatever you've chosen to allow to be planted in you. What you've sown, you will reap.
Amen.
Now, as we look a little further, we find that, once again, 32 is also associated with this Torah portion because it's the 32nd of the year. So with the 9, we're beginning to lay this foundation. It has to do with the words that we're listening to. It has to do with what's being planted in the wombs of our mind. And that's what the harvest is, what's going to dictate the harvest. What does 32 represent? Well, 32 is the numerical value of the Hebrew word zakah. And it means to be clean, to be pure, to be clear, to be justified. It has the sense of to be guiltless or innocent, to be pronounced innocent or acquitted, to grant somebody a right or a title, and to have your account credited. And when you continue to look, in fact, this word, actually the root stem of this word, if you branch off, it deals with other words, meaning granting a right, exoneration, crediting someone with something. It's a term that has legal ramifications. And we find that this is what's being associated with the Shemitah year. So now, if we look at it only from the English, we see, oh, it's agricultural. If you're a farmer, you need to pay attention to this. Because you're not supposed to reap. You're supposed to allow the land to lie fallow. You're not supposed to sow seed. And it's only when we're in the land of Israel, too. So really, there's no point in us paying attention to this. And yet we find that when you begin to dig into the Hebrew language, he's beginning to reveal something to us that when we keep the Shemitah, when we understand these concepts, there's some legal ramifications. There's something about honoring the Shemitah year that can cause you to be declared innocent. That means that when the accuser begins to make accusations against you, if you've been an individual that understands this and you've been planting the right seed, the word of Yahweh, and when the Shemitah year comes, it's as if you can be declared innocent, free, let go. And all these debts that you may have piled up, now your account can be credited. Your debts can be released. Amen? In fact, that's what the Shemitah deals with. 2 things happen during the Shemitah year. You don't plant, and debts between fellow Israelites were released. So we have to ask the question then, could the whole purpose of this cycle be to teach Israel, to teach you and I, that if our debts are going to be released, if our account's going to be credited, now some of you, you've been in debt for so long, we don't even know what it's like to be zero balanced, much less be in the positive. And so yet he's reminding you that if you'll begin to keep this Shemitah, if you'll understand these concepts, not only are your debts going to be released, but your account's going to be credited. You're going to have rights. Your title's going to be granted and restored, but it's all going to be hinging on when you begin to display the fruit of the Spirit. When you begin to show that you're walking out, that you have been in an intimate relationship, consistently walking this out with Him, putting His Word on the inside of you, and we find that when that fruit begins to be birthed, now there's some legal ramifications. There's some changes that begin to happen. Amen? Amen. And so we find this is what starts this legal process. It gets the ball rolling. And so it seems then that this Shemitah year, that when we keep this cycle that he's beginning to show us, the Shemitah year is what's going to begin the contractions. It's what's going to cause the birth to begin. And as this fruit begins to be born and made evident in your life, it's going to reveal and display that which was hidden. It's going to show you've been housing on the inside. In other words, we may be able to fool one another and walk this out and have a really good image, but when the Shemitah year comes, there's some things that begin to happen that it's actually going to bring up this harvest. It's going to make it revealed. It's going to bring out what we've planted on the inside. And so as we continue to look at this, you'll find that as we go through this, the Shemitah was dealing not just with an agricultural law, but it was dealing specifically with Israel, who had been accused of an adulterous relationship. Of Israel that had been accused of allowing other words, other seeds to be planted within them. But if they would understand the Shemitah, it would reveal whether or not they had been faithful or not. And that this is the purpose of the Shemitah. And we find that in His mercy, as we said earlier, there's 7 cycles. In other words, Israel was given 7 cycles of this, to put this into practice, to learn what it meant to plant His Word and to see it reap a harvest in their lives, to watch the fruit change, the fruit be made evident. And finally, when they got to the Jubilee, just maybe, they had dealt with all the weed seed, and it had all been cleared and gotten out, and the Jubilee, their inheritance could be restored. Because Jubilee was about the restoration of their inheritance. It wasn't just about a debt being released, but it was everything that was rightfully belonged to them. Now it could be restored to them. But we find we had to go through 7 Shemitahs, learning and understanding that we need to plant the right seed and be bearing the right fruit if we're ever going to get our inheritance back. And you realize that it took Israel 40 years before they realized what kind of fruit He was looking for? Right. They wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years after having the word of Yahweh spoken into their lives, seed planted, and yet for 40 years, again and again, what did the crop look like? We find that the crop looked like the crop of their flesh. They murmured, they complained, they didn't have faith, they didn't believe, they didn't trust, and every time things got a little difficult, they wanted to go back to Egypt. And so for 40 years, He's trying to teach them these principles of the Shemitah. If you'll learn to trust me, if you'll learn to put my word in, if you'll learn that my word will dictate to your situation and provide for all of your needs, then you finally can begin to start bearing the proper fruit. And when you bear the proper fruit, you can be restored to this inheritance that I've got waiting for you. Amen? Well, isn't it interesting that this Shemitah, it was an act of faith. We understand that Israel, every 7th year, they were being placed into a position where no longer were they in control of their own lives. They were unable to provide for themselves by the work of their own hands, and they were made every 7th year to trust in Yahweh to see whether or not His word was true. They were made to put Him to the test every 7th year, and we find that each 7th year was this time of stretching to see if He was going to be able to provide for their needs and do what He said He was going to do, and they were required to stand back and watch. You understand that most of us might not be farmers, and most of us may be completely removed from this analogy, but yet He's reminding us the principles of the Shemitah deal with you being put through a time of testing. Yes. It deals with you going through a time of stretching. It deals with you going through and being put into situations where out of no control of your own, nothing that you seem to be able to do changes it. And you're being made to stand and to trust Him, and everything else is stripped away, and you find that the only thing you've got left is the word of Yahweh. And now you're being made, are you going to stand? Do you have enough faith to trust Him that He's going to carry you through this? Amen? Amen. And this was amazing to me because all over we're hearing from individuals that are being put into situations where they're being stretched, where their faith is having to grow, and it seems that anytime you try to correct it, it just makes it worse. It seems like as everything you try to do, things just get more difficult. And I found, my goodness, Yahweh's putting us through the lessons of the Shemitah, isn't he? He's teaching us, he's stretching us, and he's beginning to see, okay, now that you're being put into this position and you're going to have to trust me, what kind of fruit are we bearing? When we're put and we're being squeezed, is it long-suffering? Is it peace? Is it joy? Is it love? Is it kindness? Or is it something else that's coming out? Well, let's look a little further here at Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. This is where he begins to share about the sabbatical years. And in chapter 25, verse 1, it begins, it says, "And Yahweh spake unto Moshe in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto Yahweh. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for Yahweh. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard." Well, we're going to begin to look at this. The title of this portion was Behar. It's translated into the English as "in the mount." It's from the root Strong's number 2022, har, and it means a hill or a mountain. And we understand they're at Mount Sinai. But the interesting thing is that this two-letter root, har, is the root stem of the word hara, which just so happens in Hebrew to mean to become pregnant, to conceive. So the interesting thing is that he's teaching them, I brought you to this mountain, and you're hearing the words of Yahweh declared over you, and the specific reason that you're here, this divine appointment, is so that my word can be planted inside of you, and you can conceive. The seed can be planted and then bear fruit. Do you realize that every single Shabbat you've come to the mountain? Every single Shabbat you're rehearsing this. You come and you're here, and the learned man begins to speak his word into you, and you should walk away having something planted inside of you, something that's going to grow. If you look here, we find that in the mount is conjugated as Behar. It has the bait prefix. It's spelled Beit Hey Resh. Well, the Beit Hey in Hebrew, means in her. In other words, the Shemitah was about a birthing in her. It's about fruit being born from the bride. Well, the final letter to this statement, in the mount, Behar, is the letter Resh. And once again, there's something interesting that takes place. There's both a blessing and a curse. The letter Resh can represent what's the head, what's chief. It can mean what is first, what leads, something that lacks nothing. But the letter Resh can also be translated as meaning poverty, something that is lacking, something that's last, something that's the tail. And so once again, as we look at this and we're looking at the Shemitah, this Sabbath year, it seems as if Yahweh was beginning to teach Israel that the Shemitah was going to be a time of birthing. The Shemitah was going to be a time that the word that had been planted inside of them, it's been cultivated now, and they've been maintaining it, watering it, hopefully, cultivating it, making sure no weed seeds getting in. And when the Shemitah arrived, that was going to be birthed. And we find that they were going to be stretched, they were going to be tested. Why? Because it was going to be the contractions, the labor pains that were going to bring forth this fruit to be presented unto him. And we find that whatever was birthed out of Israel would either cause them to be the head, lacking in nothing, the ones that were first, those that would lead, or would cause them to be the tail, what was last, what was lacking, what was in poverty, because it was going to be depending upon what they chose to allow to be planted within themselves and bring forth fruit. You realize that a lot of us have a tendency to think that the moment we begin to go through things and the moment things aren't perfect, and everything's not going fine, that the moment that begins to happen, we begin to think, oh my goodness, Yahweh, you've forgotten us. Oh my goodness, I must have done something. I must be in rebellion. There's something's got to be a disconnect. Something has to be wrong. And yet he's reminding you that there are times that you're going to be put in the desert. There are times that you're going to have to walk through the valley. And it doesn't mean I've forgotten you. And it doesn't mean that you're being disobedient. disobedient. It simply means that you're going through this process because something needs to be birthed in you. Amen? And so we find that there are times that you're going to be stretched, and it has nothing to do with whether you've been dedicated to Him, committed, and righteously walking before Him or not. It simply has to do with there are some things that He wants to birth in you that can only be birthed when you're stretched. There's some things that He wants to cause to be grown in you that can only grow when you're in the valley. And so we find that the Shemitah year was this reminder to Israel that there are going to be times that when you're going to be stretched, but be careful. Watch what you're allowing to be spoken forth, because you're planting seed. And that seed is going to carry you through. You will reap and you will eat what seed you're choosing to plant. So you will either find yourself reaping the blessings because you've obediently sown the word of Yahweh and dictated to your situation that He said that He would provide for all of our needs, or you can do like Israel did. You can murmur and complain and choose to go back to Egypt.
Come on.
We find that this concept is conveyed whether you're the head or the tail in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 13. It says, "And Yahweh shall make thee the head and not the tail, and thou shalt be above only, and thou shalt not be beneath, if that thou hearken unto the commandments of Yahweh, which I command thee this day to observe and to do them." And as I was looking at this, I thought, well, what's the difference between being the head and being the tail? And there's some interesting things, because when you trace the word for tail, it actually goes back to the root and it means to cut off. So when you're the tail, it doesn't just mean that you're last in the kingdom, which some of you, I can handle that. At least I'm part of it. But it literally means to be cut off. In other words, the Jubilee is about restoring that inheritance. If you're the tail, you're cut off. There's nothing to be restored, because instead of producing the blessings and planting the word, you've chosen to plant something else. And that harvest has caused you to be cut off. Well, if you look at these words, that word for head in Hebrew is rosh, and it has a numerical value of 501. Tail is zanav, and it has a value of 59. The difference between these two is 442. It's the value of the phrase betam, which means with integrity. This is the difference between being the head and being the tail. It comes from the root meaning completeness, integrity. It's often translated as being perfect. So are you saying that I got to be perfect if I want to be the head? No. What he is saying, though, is that when you're being tested, when you're being squeezed, those that walk through these trials with integrity, those are going to be the individuals that will be blessed and promoted and made the head, because they were showing and making evident fruit that they were walking with Him in the midst of it, instead of allowing their flesh to dictate to their situations and become the seed that was planted and dictate how they respond. Do you realize that if you walk through trials with integrity, those trials that seem as if they're just going to kill you, and it seems as if you just can't take another step and it's overwhelming, that if you'll continue to walk this out, and you'll walk it out with integrity, they become the very tools that Yahweh will use to complete you, to make you perfect, to make you lacking nothing. Because it's in these times that He's causing you to grow, that He's causing you to understand who He is, and to put your hope and your trust in Him. And that's what will cause you to be complete and perfect. This same word, Tom, was used to describe Jacob. Jacob was a perfect man. He was a Tamim. He was nothing lacking. Why? Because he spent time in the tents of Shem. He spent time hearing and learning the word of Yahweh. And it was the word of Yahweh that he chose to plant and that he chose to allow to dictate his steps. Amen. Now, if you continue to look, we're then told that you shall not be beneath. And I thought this was interesting because in Hebrew, this is Strong's number 4295. It's the word matah. And it means downwards or below, but it's the three-letter root of the word Shemitah, the mem, tet, hey. Shemitah attaches the sheen on the front. And so for me, it's almost as if there was a clue here. The whole point of how to either be the head or the tail, to be above or below, it has to do, and it's revolving around the Shemitah. It has to do with understanding the lessons that something's going to be birthed inside of you. Something's going to be made manifest in your life, and it's depending on what you've allowed to be planted, what you've allowed to be conceived. And as we've already said, every seventh day, we're rehearsing a mini Shemitah. Do you realize that if we can't plug in this concept to every Sabbath, every seventh day of the week, understanding that we're coming to the mountain, we're coming to hear the word of Yahweh, and we're going to ready the soil, we're going to make sure that it's planted in good ground, and we're going to make sure that the rest of the week we water this, we cultivate it, we make sure that it's growing, that it has everything that it needs to produce a good harvest in our life, then how can we do that for the entire year, for the Shemitah? So you see, he gives you lots of rehearsals, cyclical in nature. Every seventh day, you're rehearsing this. Every seventh year, you're putting this into practice. And it's all leading up to the 50th, the Jubilee, when you can be restored to your inheritance. And it's all depending on you beginning to show and reveal the fruit that declares to everyone, and it becomes evident that you have a relationship with Yahweh. You're walking this out. It's also important to note that every seventh year, every Shemitah year, at the Festival of Tabernacles, we're told in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 10 through 11, that the Torah was read and proclaimed before all of Israel in their hearing. They were commanded to come every seventh year and hear the Torah declared and hear the words of Yahweh spoken over them. Do you realize that Israel would have been able then to put the connection together? Every seventh year, my debts are cleared. Every seventh year, I have a Shemitah, and it has everything to do with the fact that every seventh year, his word's being declared over me into my life. And they put the connections together. When the word of Yahweh was declared over them, their debts were released. They were made free. And we find that they were learning to walk in integrity, keeping his precepts, learning that his word was what would sustain them. When I saw that, I was reminded of Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And you'll find that Yeshua quotes this verse in Matthew 4:4. In Deuteronomy it says, "And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and he fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread alone," just like you sang earlier, "but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of Yahweh does man live." That's the lesson of the Shemitah. The seventh year, you don't get to harvest anything. It was a lesson to teach you that you weren't just going to live by what you physically could gain with your own hands, but you were to live by every single word that came forth from the mouth of Yahweh. In fact, the word humbled here, it says that he humbled you. It's Strong's number 6031, and it can mean to be humbled. It can also mean to be occupied or busy with, to exercise oneself in anything, to labor upon something. It's from the root meaning to answer, to respond, to testify, to speak, and to shout. In other words, every single Shemitah year was an opportunity for Israel to exercise, to work towards, and labor towards their ability to anah, to shout, to respond, to testify, and answer and shout forth the Torah, understanding that when they did this, they were understanding and putting it into practice that every word that came forth from the mouth of Yahweh would cause them to live and not die and would meet all of their needs. Every seventh year they rehearsed this. They understood that it was now their turn to plant that seed, to testify, to speak it forth. And this is the same thing Yeshua was trying to get his disciples to understand. You don't live by bread alone, but it's about having a relationship with him, that every word that comes out of his mouth, you understand that's my sustenance. That's what's going to provide for me. That's what's going to carry me through. No matter how dark it may seem, no matter how much the storm winds are going to blow, I know that every word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh, that's what I live by. And that in turn is what we speak forth. Now, if you continue to look at this word, this root of Shemitah, the min, tet, hey, it also forms the word mateh. It means staff, branch, or tribe. Strong's number 4294. And you understand that anytime a word is used, the first time it's used is going to set the precedence for that word throughout the rest of the scriptures. The first time this word mateh, the staff, is used is in Genesis chapter 38, verse 18. It's a tale that is familiar to most of you, and it deals with Tamar and Judah. And it's when Judah accuses Tamar of playing the harlot. And yet if you go back, you know that she didn't play the harlot. In fact, she was more righteous than Judah because she ensured that the seed line continued, which happens to be the seed line of the Messiah. And so we find that if Tamar did not do what she did, then it would have messed up the whole plan for the Messiah to come through the line of Judah. We find that Tamar is proven innocence because she's able to produce the mateh, the staff, the rod. Judah gives Tamar the rod. And when she's questioned and accused of playing the harlot, when she presents this, he has to acknowledge that he's the father. It proves who planted that seed. It proves that she did not play the harlot. And so when you see this, it's beginning to set a precedent for what this rod will symbolize. And remember, the rod of Moshe, the rod of Aaron. Begin to think all the way through. This is what it's symbolized. This was the picture it was presenting. It was proving who had planted seed in Israel. Wow. It was proving who was bringing forth this harvest. We find the staff represents authority, leadership, and the ability and the right to reproduce and pass on seed. In this case, it proved the paternity of the child, who the seed came from. And we find that this is the three-letter root of Shemitah, Mem, Tet, He. The name of the portion, Behar. It deals with conceiving, with seed being planted, with a woman who's pregnant. And so then as we connect this together, it seems that the Shemitah, being connected with this staff, the source of the seed, that the Shemitah was about proving who you had accepted seed from.
That's right.
In other words, every Shemitah, you were going to have to produce the rod. The rod represented the word of Yahweh. It represented the fruit that would be born from that relationship with him. And so it seems then that every Shemitah, as he begins to tell you, the land's not going to produce. You're not going to harvest every seventh year, because the focus was you're not going to be so consumed with the natural fruit, but you're turning your attention to the fruit that's being born right here. We find that the focus was on what seed's been planted here. What fruit are you and I producing? Wow. And now we can understand why the command for every seventh year, the Torah, to be read and declared. Because every seventh year, Israel was having to prove who they'd been entertaining. Israel was having to prove who they had been listening to, who had been allowed to plant seed in their lives. And we find that as the Torah is being read, it's as if it's a paternity test. Yeah. This is what it should look like. If this belongs to me, if I'm the one that's been planting seed, if you've been listening to my words, when the Torah is declared, this is what your fruit's going to look like. And we find that as the Torah is being declared, if it doesn't look like that, it would then expose Israel as obviously having allowed someone else to cross the threshold, having allowed someone else to plant seed, to garner their hearing. They began to listen to someone else, just like Eve at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Who you hear from, what word is planted, is going to affect your harvest. It's going to affect what the fruit looks like. And so we find that every seventh year, they were being showed, does your fruit line up as the Torah is being declared? And if it did, then their debts would be released, their rights would be restored, and it would cause them to be declared justified and innocent, because accusations are being made against you. You've been adulterous, you've been unfaithful, you've been entertaining someone else, and yet when the seventh year came, it was as if it's the court case. And now you're about to prove whether or not these accusations have any merit. But we find that when the fruit's being revealed, that's what's going to prove it. And if you're able to show forth this fruit, and it shows that you've been planting the word of Yahweh, that you've been diligently walking this out, then it's going to cause you to be declared innocent, and you'll be justified, and the accuser will have to go. Amen? Yeah. Now let's look at the phrase, when you come. He says, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land. The root is the word bo, Strong's number 935, to go in, to enter, to come. But it's interesting because this word bo can also have the inference of a wife that would enter into the household of her husband for an intimate relationship. So the whole purpose, he was reminding that when you come, you're actually coming into the house of your husband. He's courted you, he's married you, he's provided for all of your needs. Now you're being brought to the place of intimacy. And after this, there should be some fruit that's born that's going to prove who you're married to. Yes. Here, though, this word bow is conjugated as tavo. And it's a cognate, the way it's spelled, it has the same root stem as the word teva. The word teva in Hebrew means ark, and it refers to the ark of Noah. And so when we see this connection, it calls me to ask the question, well, can the Shabbat, can the Shemitah be an ark? Is he revealing to us that it's a place of safety during times of judgment and trouble for others? That the Shemitah that will judge others for not walking according to the Torah will actually become something that's an ark, a place of protection for you and I, if we've understood and been keeping it? The interesting thing is that when you look at this ark of Noah, the dimensions, last week David actually brought this up, were 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. A total of 380, which happens to be the gematria, or the numerical value of Lashon, the tongue, the word. In other words, at the very beginning, what he begins to teach them is that his word would be an ark. His word would be a place of protection that would carry them through. And this was the purpose of them keeping the Shemitah. It was about them learning how to access the ark. Knowing and understanding there was a place of protection for them that they could then be closed into, hidden for a season. Do you realize that it seems to be a very simple concept, but it's one of the most difficult to walk out? It's easy to understand that his word can provide for all of our needs, and it's easy to understand that his word is a place of protection, but we find that when we're being placed into these situations, it's very difficult to actually trust in that and to release that. And we find that seems to be why we continue to go through these cycles, because each one he's teaching us a little bit more how to trust a little bit more, how to have a little bit stronger faith in him. The interesting thing is that the disciples, in the middle of a storm, they had the word on the boat. They had the ark right there with them. And yet they didn't understand that he was a place of protection until they had to go and wake them up, and they had to be reminded. Yes. I'm here. You're okay. I'm the master of the waves. Yeah. Do you realize that sometimes you and I need to be reminded of that as well? Because sometimes some storms will blow up in our lives, and we have to hear from our master, from our king, that it's okay. I'm here. My word is an ark for you. This is a place of protection, and as long as you've got me, as long as we're walking this out together, you're going to be okay. Yes. Amen? Yeah. In fact, we find that this is further emphasized in this Torah portion in verses 5 through 6, because there's a statement that he makes that should catch your attention. He tells you in verse 5 through 6 that the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, speaking to Israel. And then he goes on and says, and for thy cattle and for the beasts that are in thy land shall the increase, the produce, the fruit of the earth thereof be meat. Do you notice the distinction? He doesn't tell you that the produce of the earth is your meat during the Shemitah year. He tells you that the Sabbath is your meat during the Shemitah years. It's different for the animals, for the beasts of the field. They're going to eat the produce that's grown up from the ground. But Israel, you're to understand that the Sabbath is your meat. You're to understand that the Sabbath is your provision. The Sabbath is what's going to carry you through. In fact, the word meat here, two different words are used. The Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you is Strong's number 402, okla, and it means food, an object of devouring or consuming. But when you break this word apart, it has the aleph prefix, which means I will, and then it has the kaf lamed he root, which forms the word kala, and it means bride, which also comes from the root meaning something that's completed. In other words, when they saw this, the Sabbath shall be meat for you, as if he was revealing to Israel, I will make the one who understands this principle, I will make the one that understands my Sabbath, they'll be the ones that I will take as my bride. Now you can begin to understand why the Sabbath is so important. Yes. From the very beginning, from Genesis in the garden on, the Sabbath was the mark of those that would keep the covenant. Why? Because if you understand the significance of the Sabbath, he declares here, that's what's going to cause you to be made distinct from all the other candidates that are coming before him, vying for attention. And the ones that understand the Sabbath, that's the one that I'm going to take as my bride. Hallelujah. Amen? Yeah. It's interesting to note that when the term meat is used for the cattle, it doesn't say okla. Instead, it uses the root akal. The hay is dropped off of this one. We understand that hay represents the ability to be fruitful and conceive, and the emphasis seems to be being placed on the fact that Israel's being given an opportunity every weekly Sabbath, every seventh year Shemitah, to become a vessel that will house his seed and his word, and then in turn fulfill what that hay means. Then in turn they'll reproduce, they'll be fruitful, they'll have righteous fruit. Why? Because they have an understanding of the Sabbath. Yes. And we understand that it's those that would understand the Sabbath, this divine appointment, that it was all about coming before the king, hearing him speak the words from the mountain and becoming impregnated with his word that was going to produce seed in your life. That was the one he was going to choose as his bride. Because it was sign, it was proof, it was evidence of the marriage covenant that had been honored between the two. Amen. And now you can understand that you can do anything you want as far as the Hebrew roots. When you're beginning to cross over, you can begin to learn about the feasts, and people will leave you alone. You can begin to learn about the name and some of the traditions and the different trappings of the Hebrew roots, and people will leave you alone. But the moment you decide you're going to keep the Sabbath, you'll find that all of a sudden, now there's an issue. That's right. Why? Because it's the dividing line. It's the distinction. He tells you right here in this Torah portion, it's the Sabbath that's going to indicate who my bride is. Yeah. That's the dividing line. There's going to be a lot of candidates. There's going to be a lot of people vying for attention of the king. But the one that has been diligent and understood and kept the Sabbath, that's the one that he's interested in. Amen. That should make some of you shout because obviously you're here. Now let's look at the word for Shemitah itself. Shemitah in Hebrew is Strong's number 8059. It means remission, a release, letting drop of exactions, a release from debt. It's from the root shamat, which means to release, to let drop or loose, to smite or to strike, to cast or to throw down. And it was interesting to note that in regards to the Shemitah year, it was dealing with a debt being released, let loose, dropped. But yet, this root word shamat can also have a negative connotation. We see it being used in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 4, and it refers to Israel letting loose, shamat, losing their inheritance from Yahweh. The very opposite of what the Shemitah and the Jubilee are about. They're about having it restored. And yet there's some indicator, there's some reminders here that depending on what we're doing, depending on what kind of fruit we're exhibiting, what kind of seeds being planted, that there's a potential for something else to be let loose. Right. So instead of your debts being let loose, your inheritance can be let loose. And it's all depending on the Shemitah, the Sabbath, Shabbat. Do you think that he's revealing this to us because we're being given a choice of what we will let loose of? Yes. We have the choice of letting loose of our debts, things that have kept us bound, things that have kept us enslaved, letting loose of Egypt and Babylon and all the trappings that have so long been a part of our lifestyles. Or we can choose to hold on to those things, which will in turn cause us to let loose of our inheritance. Because remember, the bride that he's going to bring in and entertain and allow to come in and enjoy the place that he's prepared for her is going to be one without spot, one without wrinkle, and one that understands that this is about having this intimate relationship, walking this out with him. In other words, the Sabbath declares every week, choose this day whom you will serve. Amen. Amen? Amen. As we continue to look, Shemitah also has another interesting root that you can find. If you remove the mem from the middle, you're left with the sheen, tet, and the hay. It forms the word sota. It's the word used to describe the adulterous woman in Numbers chapter 5. It literally means one who turns aside, one who goes astray. So it seems as if, remember, when you break down this word Shemitah, you're dealing with these two roots, the sota, the adulterous woman, or mateh, the rod, the one that has proof, evidence of who they've been listening to, the one that has the word in the house. It seems that the Shemitah will either reveal you as the sota, one who has turned aside and been adulterous, or as one who has the mateh, the rod, the Torah in the house. And I thought it was interesting that in the case of Aaron's rod, we find that it buds. It brings forth fruit during a time of trial when he's being accused. Is it really, are you supposed to be the high priest? Are you supposed to be the one that's over all of this? we find that his rod buds, and that becomes proof. It's the same picture in Numbers chapter 5. When a woman was accused of adultery, and she's brought before the high priest to take the bitter waters of jealousy, we're told that if she drinks this and she is guilty, then her belly and her thigh are going to rot out. But if she's innocent, it's going to prove her innocence because she's going to conceive. She's going to bear fruit. The rod's going to bud. In other words, the image that we're being shown is that the Shemitah was going to put you into a trial. You were going to be stretched. You were going to be shaken. You were going to be stirred. You're going to be thrown back and forth and put out of your comfort zone, because in the midst of all this, you're going to prove whether you've got the rod that's budding or whether you've been adulterous, because that fruit's going to come out. Amen? In Matthew chapter 7, verse 20, we're told, "Wherefore by their fruits you shall know them." In fact, all of Matthew chapter 7 deals with how to deal with the fruit. Whether it produces good or bad, it's cut off, it's burned, you'll know them by their fruit. And then he also goes on to tell you that a righteous tree can't produce perverse fruit. And a perverse tree is not going to produce righteous fruit. So he spends his whole dissertation, and it has exactly the same thing to do with what Israel was rehearsing every Shemitah year. What kind of fruit are you producing? We find this term shamat, this root meaning to release of Shemitah. It's also used in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 9. And this has been shown before, but there's some other interesting things we're going to look at. In 1 Chronicles 13:9, it says, "And when they came unto the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah put forth his hand to hold the ark, for the oxen stumbled." Shamat, the root of Shemitah. And we understand that when you go back and you read the story of Uzzah, they were moving the ark. First of all, not at all like they're supposed to. It's supposed to be carried on the shoulders of the priest. They're moving it on a cart with oxen. And Uzzah reaches out when the oxen stumble to touch the ark. And Uzzah struck down graveyard dead. Now, when you read this in the English, you think, well, poor Uzzah. He was just trying to be helpful. No. The ark was going to fall, and he just reached out to steady it, and look where that got him. And yet, there's something very different that's taking place in the Hebrew language, because first of all, we already understand that they weren't supposed to be doing that anyway, and they should have known better. Yeah. Second of all, his name itself means strength, and it indicates a source of pride in his own strength. Wow. He reached out. In other words, Yahweh was not strong enough to steady the ark himself. He needed Uzzah. Begins to be the picture that's presented. But let's look at where this takes place. It takes place on the threshing floor of Kidon. And I understand, they would have understood the meaning of this name. And so now you begin to see especially what's taking place here, because Uzzah would have known what this name meant, and he still did what he did. Kidon is Strong's number 3592, and it's translated as meaning a javelin. It's from the root, though, kid, which means ruin, destruction, calamity, to strike down. In other words, before he's ever struck down, he already understood that the location that they're at deals with destruction, calamity, one that would be struck down. But the interesting thing is that as you continue to go through the roots of this word, it's roots that stem from and deal with words meaning to burn. And it's a cognate of the word kidod, which means a spark, a fire, a striking of fire. Now this was interesting because it's the priests that are supposed to be handling the ark. And we understand that if the daughter of a priest was accused of adultery, her punishment was by burning. And the name of this location, where the ark is being moved from, where the priest should be the ones handling it correctly instead of playing the harlot, literally declares that the one that would mishandle him would be burnt with fire, would be struck down. It would result in destruction, calamity. And we find that when we backtrack in the story of Judah and Tamar, we see this very declaration coming into practice. She's accused of harlotry, and he cries and declares that she's to be burnt, the punishment of the daughter of a priest who would play the harlot. And so when we see this, could it be then that during the Shemitah, it's either going to judge you as having played the harlot, and the result's going to be that like that of Uzzah, one that's struck down because you've mishandled Yahweh? Or it's going to judge you as faithful and then result in his blessings? Well, let's look a little further. It says that he reaches out, he put forth his hand to hold the ark. There's many words in the Hebrew language that can mean just to hold, to touch. But instead, the word that's used is akaz. It's Strong's number 270, and it means to grasp, to take hold of, to seize. It refers to take possession of something. It deals with ownership. You're the one that has the authority over it. It means to make oneself possessor of anything, to have possession of it. In fact, it's the root of the word akuza, which means a possession, and it refers specifically to the promised land that was the inheritance of Israel that they were commanded to go in and to possess, to take possession of, to control it, to begin to exercise the authority over it. And this is the word that's used to describe how Uzzah handles the ark. The king of all kings, his dwelling place, his throne, the ark of the covenant, Uzzah in his own strength dares to declare possession over it. And it's actually a wordplay, akuza, with the name Uzzah, strength. And so we find that Uzzah in his own strength attempted to gain possession of the inheritance that rightfully belonged only to the bride that was faithful. The only one that would be allowed into the intimate place. The only one that would be allowed to be entertained by the King of Kings was the one that was proven faithful. The one that was dressed without spot or wrinkle. She's the one that's brought in. And yet we find that Uzzah in his own strength attempts to mishandle Yahweh. And this is the picture that's being associated with the Shemitah. Do you realize that at the Shemitah, you're supposed to be his bride? We often declare that we're the bride of Messiah. And yet at the Shemitah, he's calling you forth to show forth the fruit. Because when you show forth this fruit, it's going to show whether or not you've mishandled him. Whether or not you've done something that will diminish his holiness. Whether or not you've done something that will diminish his role as your husband and king. Now let's look at the word for oxen. It says that the oxen stumbled. The word oxen is bakar, and it can mean cattle, herd, or oxen. But it's spelled almost exactly the same as the word bakar, which means to seek, to inquire, or consider. It's used to describe one who would seek and inquire after Yahweh. Now notice the phrase is that the oxen stumbled. Remember, the word stumbled means to let loose, to let it go. So when you now see this in the Hebrew, it was a wordplay, not just that the physical oxen, the cattle, stumbled, but it can also literally be translated as that they had let loose. They no longer sought out Yahweh. And that's what's taking place. In other words, the picture that's being presented is that of an individual who has ceased to inquire and seek after Yahweh. And they've allowed that to be what's let loose. They've allowed that to be what they no longer pay attention to instead of the debts that should be being let loose at the Shemitah. And we find that in his own strength, in his flesh, Uzzah still attempts to claim access to that which is reserved only for those who would diligently seek him. And now you can begin to understand the dangers of declaring that that's our inheritance. We're going back, but yet not properly presenting the right fruit. Because if you try to lay hold to an inheritance that may be yours, but we're not showing forth the right fruit, we're not walking this out, we're not showing forth the fruit of the Spirit, we become just like Uzzah. Right. And now you can understand as we get ready to close, this entire chapter deals specifically with the laws of the Shemitah and the Jubilee. All of chapter 25 deals exactly with law after law of how the Shemitah year was to be ruled and how the Jubilee would come into effect. But at the very end, the very last thoughts, in verse 1 of chapter 26, he seems to change directions completely. And he just throws this statement out there, it seems, and it deals with idolatry. Do you think that maybe it's because the Shemitah is making evident who's played the harlot, who's been entertaining idols, and who's been faithful? In fact, the interesting thing is that when you look at this encounter with Uzzah, the statement is made a few verses later that Yahweh made a breach upon Uzzah. The word breach in Hebrew is correct, and it can literally mean something that's birthed. Uzzah birthed, the fruit was birthed. And because that fruit showed that he had played the harlot, destruction. In Leviticus 26:1, Israel's being reminded of the same thing. The Shemitah is when the fruit's going to be shown. Something's going to be birthed in you. Whoever you've entertained is going to be made evident. And in chapter 26, verse 1, he makes a statement, you shall make you no idols, nor graven image. neither rear up a standing image, neither shall you set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it, for I am Yahweh your Elohim. The interesting thing is that when you begin to look at this verse in Hebrew, every single word referring to an idol is different. He does not use the same word multiple times like we see in the English. Instead, the word for idol is Elil, then graven image is Pasel, then standing image is Matzebah, and then image is Maskit. A different word describing each idol that Israel is being forbidden to entertain. Well, I thought, well, what's the purpose of this? Because he doesn't do anything by accident. He's very specific with what he chooses to say. When you add up the numerical value of all of these words, it has a total of 1,148. And some may say, well, numbers don't mean anything, but I think they do. The 1,148th verse of the Torah just so happens to be Genesis chapter 28, verse 28. Chapter 38, verse 28. It's about Judah and Tamar. It says, and it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. It was the birthing of the twins of Judah and Tamar. But if you understand the story, you know that the one that puts its hand out and gets a scarlet thread is not the one that's birthed first. There's a switch that takes place, and instead, Perez is birthed first. And Zerah comes out second with the scarlet thread. And the midwife makes the declaration that this breach will be upon you, Perez. That's right. Perez is the one that's the lineage of the Messiah. The declaration, what we see being connected here is even though you may have entertained others in the past, even though you may have been in Egypt and all your filth and in bondage, and you've made all these debts and you've entertained these idols, at the very end he reminds you of his promise of redemption. There was one that came that would take the breach. The breach would be upon him. He would stand in the gap, and you could have a scarlet thread tied around you. You could be redeemed by the blood of the Lamb because the breach was upon him. And so we find that at the very end, the last thing is he's closing out after he's dealt with the Shemitah and the Jubilee and taught you how you can be restored, this whole process of redeeming you. The last message that he sends us is that you can lack for nothing. You can have one that will stand in the gap because he sent his word. He sent Yeshua that you might live. And as long as you've got the rod, as long as you've got the word in the house, as long as Peretz is standing in the gap for you, then you can be redeemed, you can be restored, and your inheritance can rightfully once again belong to you. But it's only as long as you bring the word into the house. That's going to be the indicator, the scarlet thread, that you've been covered, you've been atoned for, you're made new. And now you can once again enter in before the king because he sent the one that would stand in the gap for you and I. And that's the message of the Shemitah, the sabbatical year.
I was kind of waiting for her to close out with the message in the Stellar Heavens.